Hi.
Hello.
My name is Madeline Hagan. I'm a historian with the firm Historical Research Associates in Portland, Oregon. Today, I am interviewing Pat Stryker on behalf of the Historic Trust for their Officers Row Memories Oral History Project. We're recording in the Marshall House on Officers Row in Vancouver, Washington. Today is November 4th, 2024. Pat, would you please introduce yourself?
My name is Pat Stryker. I first got involved in this whole area because I was hired as what was called the Central Park Coordinator when we didn't have a Central Park. And my job then was to get 11 different agencies, federal, state, local, and private, working together to commit to the plan. And the heart of that plan was basically Officers Row. So I went from that to being the city's property manager, which meant I got a whole lot of old historic buildings with no endowment for makeup or any kind of maintenance of any kind. It was kind of a challenge, but I loved it. And I was sort of here at the very beginning, not right after World War II, when two of the buildings went to extraneous partners and the rest went to the Army. But it was a fun time.
How did you come to get the job?
I got the job as the Central Park Coordinator because I'd been a library coordinator in 2 or 3 counties in Oregon and for the state of Washington. And I was always a good listener, and I found that people who thought they had nothing in common, if you served them a meal and they got to bring their boss as a guest to the meal, they all of a sudden found lots of things in common. So it worked. Always did.
So tell me about the position.
Well, the Central Park Coordinator was basically exactly what it sounds like. I would walk around and talk to, President of Clark College, talk to the head of the VA, talk to the school district, talk to the people who ran the Seroptimists who took care of the Grand House, the Red Cross people who took care of this building. And we just really explained what the plan was. And they all loved the plan in general. They sometimes had a little trouble convincing their superiors, particularly the National Park Service, had a hard time convincing their superiors that it was okay to either go back or forward in time. You didn't have to put a bubble over and live only in a 10-year cycle. So it happened, and the results are obvious.
Mm-hmm. And what was the plan like at that time? Can you describe it?
Well, it was basically kind of the predecessor of One Place Across Time. It had a geographical thing of the world, like the people who were up at the north end, like Clark College, and there were some public health agencies up there. They were sort of committing to, if they were going to plant something, it should be something from either the Arctic or the subarctic, and that moved down to southern type plantings by the time you got to the river. But there were bands that were supposed to be educational, and there were also plans to link facilities, like when Hudson's Bay built its baseball field. That was an agreement with Clark College. They would let them use it so Clark didn't have to build their own, that kind of thing. It was a very cooperative and very collegial organization of people locally. Mm-hmm. And in fact, at one point, they ran out of funding for my position. Well, the VA stepped in and they said, well, we'll put you on contract. You can keep doing exactly what you're doing. You don't have to report to us at all. We'll give you an office. That was it.
Wow.
So it was major cooperation that made it all work.
So you've mentioned a few of the stakeholders
Mm-hmm.
at play. Can you give me a...
Well, the city of Vancouver was sort of involved, particularly as relates to this building, because it owned a former recreation center up on 4th Plain that had been used during World War II. And the Red Cross, some people loved this building, other people did not. It was a very different building, much rougher, much harder to maintain and keep warm. And so the deal was to negotiate a deal between the two to swap. So that's how the city came to own this building. They gave another building to the Red Cross. That was kind of the city's involvement. And the city was a bit my home. Clark County also helped. I would have offices in both places over the times. And all the stakeholders at the school district was wonderful. And they had a lot to say about things. And Clark College did, and all kinds of people. Veterans Administration had a lot to say about things. And at the time, Evergreen State College was located in a building near here and then up on the campus of what became part of Clark College. So all these people knew one another, but they all were kind of in silos until we took the silos down. And then they were all on the same team. It was great.
And going into the job, what attracted you to this project?
I like challenges, and I saw this as an opportunity that fit right in my wheelhouse to get people to listen to one another, to modify a plan. Nothing was cast in concrete. It was just a plan on paper at the start. And so it was challenging, and I liked it. And I could see that if it came off, it would be a really big thing. So it was good.
Are you from Vancouver?
No, but I've worked in Clark County for before I retired, for close to 45 years. My late husband owned a business in Lake Oswego, so we split the difference. And I lived in Portland, but commuted here. I always worked, all my friendships were here. And when he passed away, I didn't move right away, and my accountant gave me that shake finger. Do you know how stupid it is to sleep in a bed in Portland and spend all your life in Clark County? Get over there. So I did, and I'm happy I did. I've been here now, living here for about 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And were you familiar with the row before you got the job?
A little bit. I had driven on it a couple of times. They hadn't done as much, but they had done a lot of reconstruction down at Fort Vancouver, and I always loved to visit there. So I would come up the road through and drive along here and just admire it. Then I got to be friends with some people in the arborist business, and they formed the Arboretum Committee, which then installed a whole bunch of stuff down at the far east end, and so I was here a lot then. Yep.
And what were the buildings like?
Pretty rough shape. They'd been built, of course, in the late 1800s, most of them. And as I said earlier, they did not have indoor plumbing at first. They had outdoor plumbing. They had carriage houses in the back, some of which have been converted to garages, others had been demolished. This particular house was probably in the best shape because it was where the commandant for the Army, when it was a very active Army base, lived, and George Marshall was one who lived here. And so it was in pretty okay shape. The Grant House was in sort of okay shape. It needed a lot of help, but it looked okay. And there were others. For example, the house right next door here had two professors at the VA who were doctors, and they kept monkeys unfettered. And the house was in utter shambles. I mean, these were not housebroken monkeys, and it was something. That was probably the worst of all of them. And in fact, we had to take down the rear half of it because it couldn't be salvaged at all.
Monkeys.
And all kinds of monkeys and chimps. They didn't have any great apes, but they had probably 20 different monkey types.
It's a very unique preservation problem.
Oh, it was pretty bad, yeah. Some of the others were not bad. The houses at this end were for a certain rank of officers, and from here going east, they were for more general types. And so they were much higher quality construction, higher maintenance, and they were fine. And a fellow named John Lee, who was the VA manager, actually he reported to the Portland VA, but he was here, and his heart was in the whole project. And he made sure that somehow they got budget approved to maintain, particularly the ones including the Marshall House and going east. So that was a big part of that. And then it was an interesting situation. When Ronald Reagan was running for president, one of his ideas was to sell off all federal surplus property, and that would reduce the national debt. Well, this was prime territory, and at that time, nobody wanted it sold off in ones because there was no control of what it would have been like. So it took the concerted effort of our two senators at the time and our Congress people at the time, and a lot of political pressure to get that backed off. In fact, Slade Gorton, who was the senator, who probably doesn't get enough credit, he went and sat outside the Secretary of the Interior's office And he didn't say he was senator, he just said he was Slade Gorton. And the secretary didn't know who he was. And apparently he sat there for 4 or 5 hours. And then James Watt, who was the secretary, came out and said to his secretary, "Do you know there's a U.S. senator sitting out there? How long has he been here?" "Oh, he's been here since this morning. He didn't even leave at lunchtime." Well, he went in and gave him what for. And he said, "I've already talked to my colleagues in both the House and the Senate. We will not allow this to happen." And he doesn't get much credit for that, but he probably was very pivotal in making the decision. And it was interesting.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah.
And did you have any interest in historic properties?
I did. I grew up in a family that did historic preservation restorations in California. And my late husband and I did a lot in the Pearl District, 3 or 4 about to fall down buildings, and we brought them back to life. It was fun. I always enjoyed restoration and not just remodeling, real restoration. Yeah.
Tell me about the work in the Pearl. What was that
Well,
like?
we had we owned what's now the Glisson building where Kells is, and we had offices on the first floor and a restaurant bistro in the basement, tenants. And then we bought the railway building, which faces onto Nadeau Parkway. And that was a real challenge too. Not unlike these. Didn't have central heating. It was an issue in the winter. And when the things having to do with the Rose Festival were going on, we had to hire a lot of security, be there ourselves. We still were broken into. I mean, our tenants were not a good thing. So we did another one too across the street. I can't remember what it was called at the time. But my husband had a real flair for putting together financing, and so we did it. And I just loved the opportunity with this much bigger scale and much more publicly supported project.
Yeah, and so you did the work in the Pearl before getting the job as wow.
Yeah.
So that definitely informed.
Oh yes. Yeah. We knew how to work with various restrictions having to do with historic buildings. One of our buildings was already on the National Register when we acquired it, so all kinds of things went to do with that. And Les Aucoin, who was our congressman at the time, was a close personal friend of my husband's, and he happened to chair the Senate Appropriations Committee, or the Congressional Appropriations Committee having to do with historic stuff. So he was very helpful too. And City of Portland was on our side. They sent staff with us when we were going to go to DC and testify, and so it was great.
Yeah.
It prepared me for a lot of things having to do with officers' row.
No kidding.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about the surplus process or the kind of challenges around Reagan being elected.
Oh, yeah.
And tell me more about that. Tell me about the acquisition of the property. And
well, as property manager, I managed the airport too, our airport. And the person, Tom, who was down there, the day-to-day manager, he could fly, and he had a plane. And we would fly to Federal Way and visit with the GSA probably 3 times a week, some weeks. And we finally got them to see that, this didn't make any sense. They weren't going to make that much money, and they were going to really, really anger a lot of powerful people. I mean, we had folks like Ray Hickey and George Propstra, major staples of the community, and the mayor, Bryce Seidel, completely on our side. And Bruce Higginson, who then became mayor, was a city council person. He was completely on our side. So we could exert quite a bit of political pressure, and it worked in the end. They just backed off the whole thing. I think because the GSA folks really saw that it wasn't going to generate anything but negative publicity and very little money. But I'm glad we did stop it, because it opened the door to keep these together.
Going into more technical questions about budgeting, and you mentioned the testifying process, and tell me about the National Register.
Well, it wasn't too difficult to get the whole, as a unit, get the whole thing on the National Register. The trickier parts were getting the ownership consolidated into one ownership. At the time, it was the city. This was before the Historic Trust had been formed. And it was really a stretch. I have to give them credit. most of the city council were 100% for it. One or two weren't quite sure. They wanted a bunch of old buildings they didn't have a budget to maintain or anything. But we convinced them, a whole bunch of people. We would testify at city council that we had the backing of the community and that we were sure we could get grants and that we had good uses in mind for the buildings. And at one point, they weren't going to be residences. They were going to be various kinds of shops related to historic stuff. But it never penciled out that way. And so we just moved forward with, this place became a restaurant. Eventually so did the Grant House. And the Seroptimists moved out of the Grant House because their membership had dwindled so much. They couldn't take care of it as a museum. And it was not a consolidated museum of one period. They had a tremendous collection of Indian baskets, mostly from the Yakima area, not indigenous people here. And they would fix up rooms that they envisioned were what it would have looked like when Grant lived there, which he never did. So it was just an interesting place. The dairy wives loved it because they would raise a lot of money in the summer and 4th of July because they'd set up tables out front and they'd sell all kinds of ice creamy cake things. It was great. So there's a lot of people who knew these buildings and had been in them a lot. There was a Campfire Girl office upstairs, kind of where probably one of the executive offices is now, as well as Red Cross down here. And this is where you came to get CPR training. It didn't look anything like this, but it was a good building. And then they were happy with their move too. So it took time, about 3 years altogether by the time we got everything consolidated. And it wouldn't have been possible without really active support of, for example, the VA stationed their doctors and nurses here, including those who worked in Portland. And so we had to negotiate times that they could stay and that they would pay rent, and in exchange they would be guaranteed that they have water running and heat running. There's a tremendous amount of asbestos in a lot of the basements. And so we got a grant from the state along with some city funding to get it ameliorated. And so it was just, and we had all kinds of water issues. For a while, we were losing enough water every night to fill Marshall Pool, and there was another pool called Memory Pool daily.
Oh my gosh.
And so this is the kind of thing you did. The Public Works Department and the Parks Department, although they were separate departments, we were all buddies. And so I remember going along with stethoscope at 2 a.m, and we had a crew. We were just tracking where we thought the pipes might be. No as-built, of course. And we would find where the big leaks were. Eventually, it was everywhere. Because at one time, pipes for plumbing were hollowed out redwood. They weren't terracotta or anything. They were just wood. And they, disintegrated, became mulch. And so the water just, but we got that stopped, and that helped a lot. So, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine?
It was something. And I just remember listening, and you'd hear this little, then you hear, and it was a lot of water, just because it's all rocky soil here. It never came up to the surface. There were never puddles and impoundments. It was just going down, kind of replenishing the aquifer, I'd like to say.
Yeah. And so tell me, when you're going through this process of planning,
Mm-hmm.
what this is going to become, how does that work? I mean, shops, did you have models that you looked at in other places?
No, we had a consultant company based in Seattle, and they were the ones that came up with the geographical display of the whole planet. But they also were the ones who came up with the idea. I think Pioneer Square was really hitting big time numbers at the time in Seattle, and they couldn't see why it wouldn't work here. But it really wouldn't have. For one thing, there'd be no parking because the Park Service controlled everything south, and they didn't want parking lots there. And as we became more and more historical, nobody wanted them on this side either. So, yeah, it didn't pencil in the end, based on the consultant's plans. So we had a bunch of what we call charrettes, just meetings. Y'all come, kind of let's talk about it. And we had a lot of public input. I mean, people really always cared about this place. Many who'd grown up in Vancouver had driven on Evergreen their whole lives, and they wanted it to be okay. So they would come and give ideas, and many of them were really good ideas too. So we implemented where we could and got a plan, and then got it approved by City Council, Clark County. Everybody, all the stakeholders, of which I think there were 11, they had to formally approve it and commit to it. And they did. That took about a year and a half to get done, but they did it. And then from then on, architects were hired as consultants who had specialization in historic preservation. And it was a firm based out of Portland. I was very familiar with the principals because I didn't have anything to do with choosing or selecting them, but I was glad when they got the job, and they did a really fine job. Came up with a coordinated color scheme, which, people all love this creamy color. These were not cream-colored buildings once upon a time. When the Army had them, there were pictures, not photos, but tinted drawings showing wild colors on roofs, wild colors on the building. It was the Victorian times. Things were not creamy. They were colorful. And so some of them, over the years, I think as the VA began to manage them, they wanted them uniform. And so that's where the kind of cream color with dark trim scheme developed.
Do you remember any of the color schemes off the top of your head?
Oh, so there were a couple there was one building was kind of a bright fuchsia with pink. There was a couple of others that were, bright red. The Grant House always was white. But the rest of them, they would just change. They got a good deal on paint, they'd paint them. Yeah.
And tell me about, you mentioned drawings.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of documentation did Officers Row have?
Well, they had this, like I said, from the earlier phases, they had measured drawings. There was a lot of information at the Historical Society, at the library, and the consultants they chose who specialized in historic were very good at researching, and they came up with the plans. But sometimes there were wrinkles in them. Like we had this big exhibit of Japanese art called Nihonga in this building, and outside, when people used to come back here, when it was a very active military base from Asia and other parts of the world, they would bring plants with them and stick them in the ground. And we had tremendous numbers of enormous rhododendrons around this building, but they weren't really historic, and they were all removed. When we had the Nihonga thing, it was kind of a way, because one of the sponsors of that, a company called Walcall, they had lots of money and they wanted this to go well. And so they gave the city grants to re-landscape and change the entrances and all that kind of thing. And we had thousands of people come through that exhibit. It was really amazing. It came here because a bunch of Japanese people were friendly with Bryce Seidel, the mayor, and other city council people. And Bryce talked him into having that exhibit here. Well, it had been in Boston. It had been in New York at the Met. It was a big deal, and it came here. I don't recall if it went to Seattle, but I think this may have been the only West Coast place. And so people came from LA, came from the Bay Area, all over the country to come and see this exhibit. And it was about 30 beautiful prints, exquisite prints, and all done by people who'd been declared cultural treasures to the country of Japan. And so it was a big deal.
Yeah.
But there were people very upset with the removal of the roadie. Yeah, and then we had other things happen. There had been that big storm that took down a whole bunch of the big trees out in front, and the ones that could be saved were, but over the course of time, they reached their lifespan too, and people would get very upset. We would have trees removed in the middle of the night because people would have probably chained themselves to them to keep it from happening.
Yeah.
But somehow the place goes on.
Was that the storm in '96?
Before that, it was they call it what was it? The Columbus Day storm.
Oh.
It was back, let me think, early 80s. Before they had weather forecasting as they do now, nobody saw it. It was a hurricane, a real hurricane, force winds and everything. It just blew in off the Pacific and got here quickly. And almost the pictures I saw at the time, it was before my time, but the pictures I saw when I was doing some research, I mean, huge trees were falling. Evergreen was impassable because of the trees that blew over. So things happen.
Wow.
Yep.
Tell me about working with the National Park Service.
It was a very interesting time. They would change director about every 4 or 5 years. And some of them were preservationists with big capital P. They didn't want the public. They didn't like the fact that 4th of July happened down there. They were not really cooperative. When we got a local architect who was a historian, very interested in building the bandstand, they weren't sure they liked that at all because people might come. I think that's my phone.
It's okay.
Okay. I'll just cancel it. Okay. Excuse me. So anyway, it was a challenge because we had 1 or 2 of those in the cycle as time went by. But then we had other people that were more interested in, they saw this beautiful open space as a place for the public to enjoy. And if you kept your dog on a leash, that was okay. There were a couple before them who, no dogs ever can set foot on the parade grounds over there, that kind of thing. But building the bandstand was interesting. We had to hire a person to really do serious research on exactly where the footings were and then move them over 18 inches because they didn't want to disturb anything that might be in the ground. And even on the 18-inch thing, we had to excavate, and document everything, including I remember there was a plastic spoon and fork on the top layer, and we had to put them back and leave them there because they were part of the record.
What other kind of stuff did you find?
Well, not too much. We found some old metal things, a couple, but it was fun to put the bandstand back. It was a classic example of cooperation. We had a commission from the Masons Union, Bricklayers Union, that they would install the columns. One of our very favorite supporters owned a company that produced marine grade plywood, very thick. And so I just remember visiting with her, and she picked up the phone and she called and said to her warehouse people, "I'm sending Miss Stryker to you. Give her everything she wants, put it on one of our trucks and deliver it where she wants." And so we got all the wood for it. And it was just great. But we had to agree that we wouldn't allow any amplified music and not too many big crowds. Reasonable limitations. But it's still there.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, there were 2 others. I mean, there were 3 of them on the parade grounds.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so, going from that question about the NPS, tell me more about the nomination process and the registration process.
To tell you the truth, I wasn't terribly involved with the Clark County Historical Society did most of that. As I said, a couple of the buildings were already on.
Yeah.
This and the Grant House were on. And then they just, handled getting the rest registered. I don't think there was any question. There's no opposition, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And when the actual construction got going, what were the kind of cooperations that you saw? Did it expand terribly in terms of the amount of coordinating that you had to do?
Well, it was interesting. We had a couple of the garages that had been converted from carriage houses that really couldn't be saved and didn't really have a function that related to the original building. So demolition of those was pretty easy. The actual restoration pretty much came after I had left as far as the work insides and stuff like that. I was more involved in the exteriors at one point, but I was moving on to other things by the time the work was going on inside. But I know it was all very well researched, and Ironically, this building became one that brides loved to have their weddings because they could come down the stairs, the pictures were gorgeous. They often had the weddings out in front, and that was nice too.
Did you have weddings in mind when you guys were
No,
planning?
it just sort of happened. We didn't even have a restaurant in mind when a guy came forward and said, I think this could be a great restaurant, and he didn't make it. The first guy didn't. And then somebody else came in and tried it for a while and decided it's just too big. And then they went over and ran a restaurant when it got established in the Grant House. So, a lot of things were tried. If they worked, we kept them. If not, moved on.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. And how did you land on residencies for?
Well, we agreed. How did we decide that they would be residents?
Residences, yeah.
That seemed to be the most reasonable, and frankly, there were a lot of VA doctors and nurses still living in them who wanted to continue that, which was fine. I mean, they were very good caretakers. They loved these buildings. They took good care. So that was pretty easy to just do that. We had to have them sign leases with the city, and they were perfectly willing to do that. And pretty much everybody paid on time and lived up to their agreements. A couple of them didn't like the fact that we had uniformity required for Christmas decorations. They wanted to do other more flamboyant things on the front. No, can't do it. We want uniformity. So it worked.
Yeah, tell me some more of the rules regarding historic character.
You had to park in the back, and you were supposed to tell your guests to use the back road. We were not going to put in any more parking out in front, and we really needed it for the Grant House and the Marshall House. So people were willing to abide by the rules. Frankly, they weren't terribly different from what the VA had in place. And, like I said, they could have pets, but we had to approve them. And we didn't allow any monkeys ever again. Those are the only people we pretty much evicted. Mm-hmm. And I have no idea what happened to all the critters that live with them, but they were gone. And that place probably had the most complete restoration. All the floors, most of the walls, not remodeled, but replaced with good, solid, clean stuff. So it worked.
Yeah, and in terms of in an earlier interview, we heard about curtain length and stuff like that. Can you tell me more about the?
I don't know about those. Yeah.
Totally fine.
No. I was more concerned with the exteriors.
Sure.
And for example, when we were selling bricks, commemorative bricks, that was supposed to go to exterior fine touches that might be outside a normal budget, and it worked. We sold quite a few. Not as many as the city of Portland and the downtown square, but we did sell quite a few.
Yeah. Do you have a brick?
I do.
Do you know where it is?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
That's pretty fun.
Yeah. And I got one for my mother and my pa. I mean, people bought quite a few. If you were going to get into it, you got into it. Mm-hmm. So we did at one point have a kind of a diagram. You could find it, but I have no idea what happened to that. So I've gone back, and you have to look carefully, but you could find them if you got some time.
So tell me about towards the end of your tenure as with Central Park. Where did you go from Central Park?
I went directly into the city of Vancouver. I was assigned in the Parks Department originally, and then in the manager's office. And at that time, the city staff was pretty limited. So we were all cross-trained. I mean, if you wanted to put out a bid package, you made your own blueprints. If you wanted to make copies of something, you ran the copy machine. If you needed anything from Public Works, you just called them up and they did it. It was kind of, don't ask me how, it'll just happen. Like the day we were celebrating the transfer of these properties, Evergreen was in terrible asphalt shape. It was really bad. And I remember calling Vic Ehrlichman, who was the Public Works Department director, and said, Vic, how can I get this road looking better? He said, don't ask. And then he said, and when do you need it? And I said, in about 4 days. He said, it'll happen. don't ask. And it would. And that was kind of the way the whole city staff operated. Make a long story short, I ended up on a rotation in the planning department, and I happened to be on the permit desk when the Red Line Company had got in trouble because they had chopped down some trees to improve views of one of the original owners, and they wanted to do something else at the Red Line Inn at the Key, which they had not applied for any permits for. And there were actually cease and desist orders on my table to give them. But I said, if you're willing to work on this together, I can help you through the permitting process. I'm pretty good at it. I've been doing it now for years. So you fill out this form, we'll get your stuff going for the shoreline permit so they could do what they wanted to do down at Red Line. And we'll negotiate how much, I won't say his name, one of the owners has to pay, including replanting all those trees. Now, he can either like it or it's a misdemeanor and he will be prosecuted. In fact, I have the orders right here to do that. So do you want to work on it? They did. And so 3 or 4 days later, I got a call from the Red Lion HR person and said, we want you to come work for us. And I said, well, I'm really very happy with what I'm doing. And she said, what salary would it take? So I doubled what I was making at the city. They said, can you start tomorrow? And I said, not after all these years. I need at least 2, if not 3 weeks to transition because a lot of stuff has to be carefully reassigned. And so I went to work for them.
Wow.
And it was a very exciting time, I must say.
Yeah.
Very different.
How did your time with Central Park and Officers Row inform that position?
Well, I was the government relations vice president, meaning I had to pour oil on troubled waters because these properties, at 11 states, 53 properties, they were always breaking the rules. And the old approach was, well, if they catch us, we'll pay fines. We're not going to get permits to do what we want to do. And so I had to kind of change the culture. Fortunately, new owners at the top supported the change in culture. But I would go to work with a suitcase under my desk every day of cold weather clothes and warm weather clothes, and I had a jet standing by with pilots 24/7. And I'd get a call, and they say, the health inspector's going to shut us down today, and today's the Christmas luncheon for the Rotary Club. We can't be shut down. So I call the planning department guys. I can be there in 2 hours. Let's talk before you take action. And I had carte blanche. I could do pretty much whatever we needed to make sure we didn't get in too much trouble. Mm-hmm. And we avoided a lot of trouble. But for some of the older general managers, it was a real shift. And I had authority to fire them, and I had to do it 2 times because they would not agree to do what needed to be done. In fact, one of them I remember, I told them that I was here from headquarters, and I gave them my card, which had my officer name on it. And I said, I can give you about an hour, but you are leaving the property today with escort. And in fact, we'll be going to your home and retrieving any items you have there that might be of interest. He couldn't believe it. So I had the president's direct line number, and I said, Jerry, you need to straighten out something. And I handed it to this guy. I said, it's Jerry Best. He had never talked to the president of the company. And you could see his face just go white. Okay. So, you had to do what you had to do. Mm-hmm. That was, in fact, the day that was supposed to be the Rotary Luncheon in a big town. It would have been an utter disaster if they had to cancel it. And they didn't. But they could have, because the guy was really bad and not a good thing. So, ironically, my go-to guy was Mark Mathias, who ended up owning beaches. And the both times I had to fire people, I would send the plane up to bring him down. And he was so smooth, so accommodating, so willing to work with people. Solved all of our problems.
Wow.
So that was in Burbank and in Santa Barbara. He had to come in, step in, and make it work. And he did.
Mm-hmm. And tell me about the kind of permits that you were doing with Central Park.
Oh, let's see. Anytime we built something, we had to get a permit. Anytime we were changing anything, we had to get a permit. If you touched anything along the waterfront, you had to get a shoreline management permit. And there was a lot of shoreline work we did too, totally separate from the Officers Row area. It was just, I was the responsible party who had to sign all these things. In fact, I went to work for the port after the city and red line thing, and my boss there said, "You are going to be the responsible party on our permits." I said, "Well, sure, it goes with my job." And he says, "That means if we screw up, you're the one going to jail, not me, right?" And I said, "We won't screw up because you're absolutely right." It was funny. I mean, I enjoyed all of the aspects of all of my jobs, and they kind of have a link, but not very obvious sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, working with people and
That was the key thing, being able to listen and walk a mile in their shoes. Because some of them, it was tough. I mean, they had hard jobs because they had absent supervisors in D.C. or the Region 9 districts were in Seattle or Federal Way, and those folks didn't come around very often. So they didn't know what they had to go through on a day-to-day basis. But we were always fortunate. The right people came at the right time. And they all seemed to meld together. They'd get mentored by the other guys in other agencies who had come to see the light, and they would share that light. It was good.
Tell me about how you feel Officers Row fits in, or even Central Park fits into the broader Vancouver community or Portland Metro.
I think it's absolutely critical. The whole thing, schools all over Oregon and Washington visit the fort, and they get to see, how did this all happen? Why were people here? They also get to see all the green space. And I know from people who have no idea how challenging it was to keep that green space behind here. There were plans once upon a time to build a convention center, including taking out Fort Vancouver Library's office here and just building out that whole thing. Well, Hudson's Bay High School didn't want that. That's where they practiced. Nobody wanted it because it was a big green space. Again, if you get the community on your side, you can hardly stop them. And we had the community all the time. I think it's a lesson, actually, to a lot of the other development in Clark County to start low and get the people excited about something, then get the middle management excited about it, and get the senior management willing to take the credit. And they do, even if they might not have been on board at the start. So it worked.
Yeah.
It was a good lesson.
Great lesson.
Yeah.
So do you still live in Portland?
Oh, no. I've lived here for a long time now.
And tell me about why were you so interested in Clark County?
I just liked the people I met. They seemed to have a vision, and particularly at the highest leadership levels, they were really happy to share that vision and commit to it. And that was kind of unusual. Some of my other projects before I started here, it would take a long, long time to get people to even be willing to talk about things. Not here. Everybody was very, very willing. And as long as you could show results and you didn't grossly overspend a budget, they would let you do what you needed to do. And for example, a lot of other historic buildings, not just Officers Row, fell in my lap. And some of them were in pretty bad shape. The Covington House up on Upper Main, it was about to fall in. I mean, literally. And the roof had to be replaced. And, I could work with both Public Works and Transportation because there were so many transportation needs that you had to get the transportation people on your side if you wanted to propose a new item for a budget. And they could see the need for it. And so, we took care of it. Down by where it's now Saturday Market, that big old, I can't remember the name of it now. It has a name. The Victorian house on the corner. It was a theater inside. And Clark College Drama Department used it as a theater. But the exterior was falling apart. And people at the Columbian really wanted it to succeed. So we got some private donations to make it look okay and be stable. And now it's, people just walk by it every day and it's just there. In fact, I think part of it's been converted to some of the public restrooms for the Saturday Market and the Esther Short Park area. So, yeah.
Tell me about your best memories working either with Central Park or Officers Row?
I think the day that we finally got in our hands the piece of paper that was a deed to all of these buildings, and I got to hand it off to the mayor. I mean, it was wonderful. It was really wonderful. And it became a little frightening too, because then we had to do something about it. But we had the support to do it, and we did. So that was probably my best memory. Best memory on Central Park was I was walking in the rain, hard rain, from Clark College down to City Hall. And the principal of Hudson's Bay High School pulled over and said, "What are you doing walking in the rain?" I says, "Well, I had a meeting up at Clark, and now I'm going back to my office in City Hall." He said, "Get in the car." So that kind of thing happened all the time. And for a while, I had an office actually in one of the officers' row houses down at the far end. And that was kind of fun. It was great.
Yeah,
And-
what was that like?
Well, it was really fun because the Parks Department people, was a small number, we would do midnight plantings. And the bridge across, Evergreen Bridge across I-5, one time we got 500 or 600 red tulips and just given to us. And we would organize at my office, let's meet here at about 1 in the morning, and we won't ask anybody's permission, we'll just go out and plant them. And the bulbs be in the ground, nobody will even know they're there until next spring. We would do that kind of thing all the time. A friend of mine, Kelly Putney in the Parks Department, who had a lot to do with a lot of design, he was active in the Rhododendron Society. And Fred Meyer had reneged on a big series of contracts right before Mother's Day of 1-gallon roadies. And Kelly got a call and said, "If you can come get them, you can have them all, because otherwise we're going to plow them under." Well, every piece of city rolling stock, and I mean virtually everything, in public works, in parks, in the water department, we had these caravans going down I-5. Some of them probably hauling loads that were not quite legal, but we brought back, I mean, many thousands of roadies, and they're all over. You see them now all over the town, because they've been now in the dirt for 15, 20 years. They're big, but it was fun. We used to do that kind of stuff all the time.
What is it like to drive either on Officers Row or pass any of these houses with
Oh,
rhododendrons that you...
I get a nice, fun feeling every time. For my 60th birthday, the Arbor Society planted a tree. It doesn't have a plaque over here. And I was driving my family just to show them Officers Row. And I was looking this way, and my sister-in-law said, "Yeah, there's a whole bunch of people gathered at that thing. Looks like a bandstand. I wonder why they're there." And I looked, and it was all these people I knew, and I went, "Oh, it's a surprise party." It was. That was fun. Yeah. And they knew what would touch my heart. Having a tree planted on Officers Row would be just perfect.
You've got a brick and a tree.
A brick I bought and a tree they gave me. Yes.
Oh, that means a lot. Are there any questions that you wish that I had asked you?
Not really. You've covered a lot.
Good.
Thanks. Yeah.
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 I think we're good.
Okay.
Thank you.
you.